One of the questions I'm often asked is, if I wear a set of hearing aids, am I able to hear like a person who's got normal hearing? Good question, and somewhat challenging to be able to answer that. The results differ from person to person. They've done some tests recently on people who've got mild to moderate hearing loss, and fitting them with a certain hearing aid and putting those people into a noisy environment. They were able to assess them, and they were actually able to prove that the person with the hearing loss wearing these new hearing aids in a noisy environment was able to hear better than a person with normal hearing. That was because the person who was wearing the hearing aids was getting the benefit of that hearing aid reducing the competing background noises. Now, where you've got to be really careful is that does not apply to everyone. So that applied to certain individuals, and it normally applied to people with a mild to moderate loss. Now, the more severe your hearing loss, the less likely that is to apply to you. And so in this video, I just want to discuss why that is, why there's limitations in terms of the results that you can expect to get from a hearing aid. And to try and keep this as simple as possible, I think what we've really got to understand is that when it comes to comprehending speech, understanding what people are saying, which is what most people get a hearing aid for. Most people get a hearing aid to be able to improve their ability to communicate with others. But it's a two-step process. And the two steps are very simple. The first step is that the function of the ear is simply to hear. The function of the ear is basically to detect the sound. So the sound has to be audible. If you've got a hearing loss and someone talks softly, the sound isn't audible. You may not be able to hear it. So when you wear a hearing aid, it amplifies the sounds around you, it brings them up, and it makes them audible. So that's the first step in the process. It's not the final step. So the second step is that you then have to process what you're hearing. So that's not the function of the ear. That's now the function of the brain. So this is where you've got these two steps that are both critical. You've got to be able to hear the sound, and then you've got to be able to process it. So as I often say, it's not just a matter of what you hear, it's a matter of what you do with what you hear. So that whole cognitive aspect is critically important. Now, if you want to think about hearing aids in terms of making you hear better, giving you that audibility, in essence, when a hearing aid amplifies everything, so it brings up the speech, it brings up the noise, a person with a hearing loss wearing that hearing aid, you would think, should be able to go into a noisy environment, for instance, and be able to hear and understand everything, just like the person with normal hearing. So in essence, when you're wearing a hearing aid, yes, we are bringing the speech up and we're bringing the noise up. So in essence, we're making you hear what a person with normal hearing hears, but it doesn't correct the cognitive side of things. It doesn't correct how you process what you're hearing. So a person who's got normal hearing is used to functioning in a noisy environment. They're used to hearing the speech. They're also used to hearing the noise. And mentally, they're able to tune the noise out and focus in on the speech. Now, the typical person with a hearing loss has had a hearing loss for quite some time before they've addressed the issue. So that means that they've become conditioned to not hearing everything at a normal level. So they go into a noisy environment. The speech isn't very loud, so they're finding it difficult to hear that. There's noise that's drowning out the little bit of speech that there is. But even the noise they're not hearing at a normal level either. And people tend to deal with this in different ways. So typically what I find is that people will either sit in a noisy room, let's say they're out at a restaurant, they're at a table with half a dozen, 6, 8 people, maybe 100 people in the room, and they'll sit and smile and nod their heads, and they're tuned out. They're not actually listening, they're not engaged with what someone's saying, because even if they try, they find they can't. So that's the first way in which they tend to deal with that issue. Or they may sit there and they'll daydream. They just nod their heads. They're pretending that they're actively listening, and they're not. The other way they deal with it is to withdraw, is to avoid going into those situations. But in both of those scenarios, the hearing impaired person is not employing their listening skills. They're not focused in on the person that they want to hear and ignoring all the background noise. They're tuned out. They're no longer in that environment. Now, what the person with the hearing loss expects is to wear a hearing aid, go into that noisy environment and regain those skills instantly. Just be able to function like a person who's been operating in a noisy environment every day for the last 10, 20 years. That's not going to happen. So for some people, when we fit them with hearing aids, if their cognitive skills are still really good and really heightened, and I normally find this to be true of a lot of my younger clients, so I've got a client who's maybe 30 years of age, fit them with a set of hearing aids, put them in a noisy environment, they'll function well. Now try doing the same thing with a person who's 80 or 90. They've had a hearing loss for 30 years, so their brain hasn't been stimulated. Now, as we all age, we tend to slow down mentally. It takes us longer to recall and make connections. And so our ability to process slows down. And so that's another factor that we've got to take into account. So the major factors that I find that influence your cognitive ability to process speech in a noisy environment typically tends to be how bad your hearing loss is, how long you've had the hearing loss, and then thirdly, how old you are. So those things all go together to be able to determine how well you're likely to cope in a noisy environment. Now, when I think back to my 30-year-old clients, they will typically, at their follow-up appointment, after we've done a fitting, they've gone out, they've used the hearing aid for a week or so, they've come back, and we're now reviewing how they're getting on. They will typically have a list of all the things that they're now hearing. They're hearing the microwave oven, they're hearing the gravel under their shoes, they're hearing the wind, they're hearing the birds, they're hearing all this music, they're hearing traffic noise, they're hearing all of these things, and they think this is wonderful because they're now reconnecting with what they've been missing out on. Now, at the same time, I will have my elderly clients come back with exactly the same list, except this time they're not big positive ticks. These are all negative crosses. They don't want to hear the birds chirping. They don't want to hear the kettle. They don't want to hear the noise in the other room. They don't want to hear any traffic noise. They don't want to hear the gravel under their shoes. And so you've got totally different expectations. The elderly person often has become accustomed to the peacefulness of their hearing loss. That's what they like. They want to be able to communicate and understand, but they don't want anything to change. Now, if you don't hear a high frequency sound, and therefore you only hear part of a word, we've got to make you hear what you don't normally hear in order to improve your hearing. So things have got to change. We can't keep everything the same and expect a different outcome. For you to hear better, we've got to get you hearing sounds that you're not used to. Now, the best way I find to be able to do this is to fit you with a set of hearing aids and set them at a level that you find relatively comfortable. So if we set them too high, right up on target where your hearing's all the way back to where we'd want it to be, most people are going to reject that. It's too loud, it's a shock to the system, and you're not going to be able to put up with that. And therefore, it's a much better method to be able to start at the level that you find comfortable. It's just a starting point, and over time, if you're wearing the hearing aids all the time, your brain will adapt, and then we're going to be able to basically gradually lift your hearing up. But the goal is to wear the hearing aids. And that means you put them on in the morning, you take them off at night. So your brain is conditioned to hearing through the hearing aids. That becomes your new norm. That's what you become conditioned to. And then we can gradually move from there. So it's a process to take you from where you are to where you need to be. Now, getting back to the background noise scenario. So as someone who's got really good cognitive skills, typically they're going to function well, maybe even with a basic hearing aid. So we simply give them audibility. They hear all the speech, they hear all the noise, they go into that noisy restaurant, they function well, no problem. They don't necessarily need a sophisticated hearing aid. Other people, their cognitive skills are very bad. So the longer you've had your hearing loss, the older you are and the worse the loss, the more chances you have of not functioning well with a basic hearing aid. And so what the modern hearing aid does, the top-end hearing aids, they have a whole suite of different features which are designed to be able to reduce the noise and maximize the speech. So what we're trying to do is make the speech dominant and then reduce the noise as much as possible. So the hearing aids are doing things which are artificial, but they're very beneficial. So they're adjusting the noise and the speech to be able to make the speech as simple and as clear as possible for you to be able to understand and comprehend.